It's interesting that Beethoven's Emperor Concerto is only known as the Emperor in English-speaking countries. I'm a German speaker. I go to Germany quite a lot, and I have never, ever seen it described as the Kaiser Concerto on a German program or a German record, or heard anyone refer to it as that. Apparently, it was an English pianist who gave it its nickname. How appropriate is it? Sometimes musical nicknames, well, they're very helpful because Emperor is a lot easier to remember than Piano Concerto Number 5 in E flat major, isn't it? But how helpful is it in this case? Well, in this case, I think it tells quite a complex story. The emperor that clearly the nicknamer was thinking of was Napoleon Bonaparte, the great hero of revolutionary France, military hero, and then the leader of France, who finally, to Beethoven's horror, had himself crowned emperor in the presence of the Pope. To Beethoven, that was a betrayal, the final betrayal. He'd already had his doubts about Napoleon. And throughout his life, his feelings about Napoleon really seesawed. On the one hand, how could he not admire a man who came from a relatively lowly background, who managed to work his way up to the top, to the point where at one point he was frankly leader of all Europe. But at the same time, Beethoven could see the cost too of Napoleon's incessant military campaigns. And about the time he wrote the Emperor Concerto, 1809, Napoleon's forces had invaded Beethoven's Vienna and made a real horrible mess of it in the process. Beethoven himself found the whole experience very traumatic. He'd stayed in the city, unlike most of his aristocratic patrons, and there's a poignant story of him trying to protect what was left of his hearing, because of course his deafness was pretty well advanced by this stage, by putting his cushions over his ears and hiding in the cellar of the house in the hoping that the sound of the bombardment wouldn't damage his hearing any further. But there's an interesting, well, I was going to say double, but almost triple-sided quality to this, in inverted commas, Emperor Concerto. The first movement begins with a magnificent sort of imperial, here I am, huge orchestral chord. Very grand, and the piano comes cascading in with unbelievable virtuoso figures. This is really not what classical concertos were supposed to do. In classical concertos, it was the norm for the soloist to kind of wait while the orchestra presented the main themes of the concerto in a kind of overture. And then a little later, when the audience's excitement has got worked up, in comes the soloist and takes control of the argument. In the case of Beethoven's Emperor, it's the pianist who absolutely strides onto the stage and says, here I am. You can imagine this is Napoleon, an imperious gesture, and magnificent. And there is indeed a story that one French soldier, hearing this for the first time, actually cried out, Vive l'Empereur, at this point. Okay, but the relationship between the piano and the orchestra, as so often in Beethoven's concertos, is very, very interesting. It isn't long before you get the impression, if you like, that the orchestra is beginning to question the pianist's imperious self-presentation. And the mood of the first movement goes through many, many changes. Although the pianist is still the star, you might feel that by the end of the movement, his relationship to the orchestra and his sense of who he is, if it is a he, has changed completely. Of course, it would have been a he in Beethoven's time. Beethoven would have wanted to perform this concerto himself, but unfortunately he couldn't, of course, because of his deafness. But then after this first movement comes an exquisitely beautiful slow movement, which is just all quiet. The piano is reduced to extreme delicacy instead of force. And remember, when you hear these sounds, which are unlike anything in piano music before Beethoven's time, that the man who wrote them couldn't hear them. He was relying entirely on his own inner sense of what might work. There's a story that somebody visiting Beethoven towards the end of his life found him with his teeth on the piano, hammering away at an idea, because he'd come up with a chord that was so extraordinary. He wanted to see if there was some way he could sense through vibrations in his body whether this worked or not. But his ear never let him down. It's extraordinary. Then comes a beautiful moment of transition at the end of this slow movement when The harmony changes, there's a moment of expectation, and the piano begins to pick out an idea. It's almost as though the piano's not playing anything that's written down. It's as though he or she is improvising in front of us, right in front of us. And then suddenly comes the moment where the light goes on and it turns into this marvelous waltz. And off it storms. Now, the fact that it's a waltz is significant. The waltz was beginning to emerge in Beethoven's time as the signature dance of Vienna. So in a way, we're beginning to see a transition in Beethoven too. At the beginning of the concerto, we have Beethoven's imperial ambitions, in a sense, as a pianist composer, and also the fact that he had at one stage hero worship Napoleon, the man who proclaimed himself emperor. But then in the first movement, we can hear Beethoven beginning to question maybe that earlier sense of identification. The slow movement suggests something else, a haven of peace in the middle of Napoleon's carnage. And finally comes the waltz, the movement in which Beethoven identifies with his new home, Vienna. He's moving on, in a sense. This is Beethoven going through a transition in his own thinking and his own feeling, and we can hear this enacted in this concerto. But as I said, you don't have to hear that story in the music. It's just so gripping and exciting in its own right. And there's a lovely little humorous touch towards the end. There is another of those passages in concertos that are called cadenzas, a passage in which the orchestra stops and the pianist is left to play for him or herself. But this time, the orchestra doesn't quite stop. One instrument keeps going, and it's a very surprising instrument. It's the timpani, the drums. They keep playing the bum, ba-dum, bum, ba-dum in the background. And even when the piano comes to rest, the timpani are still there. And finally, there's a great joyous dancing end, and the concerto ends too. So humor, too, very important part of this concerto. Beautiful colors, drama. It's no wonder it's become so popular. And I suppose you could say amongst concertos, it is a bit of an emperor. Before that, Haydn's Symphony number 101, nicknamed The Clock. Now, this time the nickname is very much easier to understand. When you come to the slow movement, for instance, there's an incredible tick-tocking that goes on all the way through accompanying the tune, and it put people in mind very much of the clock, mechanical clock, which actually for an awful lot of people in Haydn's time was a very new phenomenon. So a spread of clocks in Haydn's time and the mechanical devices like that, later metronomes, for instance, was something that was very, very new. So you'd be like a composer today acknowledging, well, I was going to say mobile phones, but they're an old thing, aren't they? So the latest digital technology in a piece. Haydn has, well, he was Beethoven's teacher, and Beethoven clearly learned a lot from him, although the relationship was somewhat fractious, as it often was between Beethoven and people in positions of power. But he also, that humor I talked about in Beethoven's Emperor Concerto, well, you can really see where he got the idea of musical humor from, because Haydn's Clock Symphony, apart from that wonderful second movement, is just full of that fabulous playful humor that Haydn loves. I think some people don't get Haydn because he sounds a bit like Mozart. And you can approach Haydn thinking, well, I guess this is going to be like Mozart. Couldn't be less like Mozart. It's utterly different, and absolutely at the basis of Haydn always is playfulness. Sometimes it can be a dark playfulness, but here it's indescribably sunny after a slightly sort of shadowy beginning. And at every stage, well, it's almost like playing with a cat. If you play with a cat, you can be sometimes amazed at how quickly a cat can move. It's almost as though the cat's there one moment and there the next. Haydn has that kind of quality. He thinks absolutely in lightning speed, and wit and humor are absolutely part of his, well, his armory. He's one of the few classical composers who I can think music just sounds genuinely, even profoundly happy. And this is a really good example of that. Before that, the overture to Bellini's opera Norma, from which comes the famous aria Casta Diva that Maria Callas made such a wonderful, beautiful thing out of. This is much simpler music by either Haydn or Beethoven, but never mind, it's wonderful. It's set, composed as a curtain raiser to get you in the right mood, to get the audience to shut up at the back and prepare themselves for the moment where the curtain goes up and the action begins. And it does that beautifully, and it does that beautifully as well in terms of this concert too. So rather nice combination of pieces there.